It all started with a single gunshot, a shot that pierced a man's flesh and, with it, shattered the heart of an entire era. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated during a visit to Sarajevo, a seemingly isolated crime committed by a young Serbian nationalist, but one that ignited a spark in a continent saturated with hatred, rivalries, and broken promises. What no one knew was that this moment would mark the beginning of a global collapse. Within weeks, secret alliances activated like traps, countries declared war on each other like dominoes falling out of control, and the entire world was dragged into what many believed would be a brief patriotic conflict, but which quickly became a machine for grinding lives. A war where soldiers went mad in filthy trenches, where the sky was torn by planes dropping death, and where science turned against humanity, creating chemical weapons that melted skin, eyes, and hope. But what really caused World War I? Was it just the assassination of the Archduke, or was there something much bigger behind it? Get ready, because behind the scenes of this war revealed dark secrets, cold decisions, and hidden interests that were never told to you in history class. Between 1914 and 1918, the world plunged into a nightmare from which it would never fully awaken. World War I wasn't just a conflict between nations, it was the death of an era, the end of the modern world's innocence. Millions of lives were wiped away as if they were numbers on a spreadsheet, while centuries-old empires collapsed under bombs, bayonets, and decisions made behind closed doors by men who never stepped onto the battlefield. This war marked the first time humanity used industry to kill on a massive scale. Tanks roaring through blood-soaked fields, toxic gases suffocating soldiers in trenches, and entire cities reduced to ruins. But behind the gunfire and explosions, there was much more. Webs of alliances built on distrust, colonial disputes masked as patriotism, and an elite that saw war not as tragedy, but as opportunity. In this video, we'll dissect the true causes of World War I, reveal the hidden interest behind the declarations of war, and explore the events that turned a continent into an extermination ground. Because to understand the world we live in today, marked by unstable borders, constant conflicts, and political scars, we need to return to the moment when it all began, when Europe exploded and took the future of millions with it. It was a cloudy morning on June 28, 1914, when Franz Ferdinand, Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, entered Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. They were on an official mission, but also in a celebratory mood. However, the city was far from safe. Slavic nationalist groups, outraged by Austro-Hungarian control over Bosnia, were planning an attack. Among them, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip carried a revolver and a mission to free his people with a single act. The first assassination attempt failed. A bomb thrown at the official car missed. Still, the couple continued with the agenda, ignoring the warnings. Hours later, as the driver took a wrong turn through the city's narrow streets, fate intervened with terrifying precision. By coincidence or cruel irony, the car stopped exactly where Gavrilo was standing. Without hesitation, he fired 2 shots. One hit Sophie, the other, Franz Ferdinand. Both died minutes later. What seemed like just another political attack in an unstable region became the spark for something much greater. Austria blamed Serbia and, with Germany's support, prepared a brutal retaliation. Russia moved to defend the Serbs. France and Britain joined shortly after, activating alliances silently woven in previous years. Thus, the assassination of a single man in a city forgotten by tourist maps of the time lit the flame of a war no one expected, or worse, that many secretly desired. But why would an empire react with such fury over a single act? And who truly benefited from the chaos that followed? What lay behind this geopolitical chessboard goes far beyond the official story. Even before the first official shot was fired, Europe was already a minefield of secret agreements, sharpened rivalries, and promises of mutual destruction. The Archduke's assassination merely pushed the pieces of a game already set. Behind the scenes, powers had been obsessively arming for years, as if they knew a global war was inevitable. On one side was the Triple Entente, a pact between France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, comprising Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. What seemed like a strategic balance quickly became an automatic trigger. When Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia, an ally of the Serbs, mobilized troops. Germany, seeing that as a threat, responded with a declaration of war on Russia. The next day, it declared war on France, and when the Germans invaded Belgium to attack France, the United Kingdom entered the war. All of this happened in less than a week. A web of treaties turned an isolated attack into a continental wildfire. But don't be fooled. These alliances weren't just defensive pacts, they were power plays. Germany wanted to expand its empire and break the British naval blockade. France dreamed of avenging its defeat to Germany decades earlier. Russia sought control over the Balkans. Each of these empires saw the conflict as a chance to redraw the map of Europe, and they were were willing to sacrifice millions to do it. The race to war was fueled by cold strategies, military plans prepared years in advance, and a blind confidence that it would be a quick, glorious, and profitable conflict. But what none of them expected was that pulling the trigger would open the gates of a hell that no one could control. The war many thought would end in weeks turned into a prolonged nightmare that lasted for years. With German troops halted in France, the conflict reached a brutal stalemate. Trench warfare was born. Over thousands of kilometers, soldiers dug deep corridors into the damp, dirty earth, turning European soil into a muddy labyrinth of despair. Inside those trenches, life was constant torment. Rats infested the shelters, diseases spread rapidly, and the fear of a surprise attack kept everyone in a permanent state of terror. Rain turned the ground into thick mud, clinging to uniforms and swallowing the bodies of the dead. Every order to go over the top meant soldiers walked into what they called no man's land, an open field between the armies, full of barbed wire, bomb craters, and decomposing corpses. Advancing meant running under machine gun fire and artillery explosions. As if the brutality wasn't enough, technology brought a new kind of terror: gas. In 1915, Germany was the first to use chlorine gas on a large scale. Yellowish clouds descended slowly over enemy trenches, burning lungs, blinding eyes, and leaving soldiers in agony until death. Then came mustard gas, colorless, silent, deadly, even in small doses. It was impossible to know if you were inhaling death until it was too late. World War I stopped being just a territorial conflict. It became a macabre experiment where humans tested how far they could go to destroy others and themselves. In the trenches, soldiers no longer fought for empires. They fought for minutes of life. And that reality, more than any flag, defined the true horror of this war. As the war consumed Europe, the world watched closely, but not for long. What started as a regional conflict quickly became a global clash. Empires with colonies around the world dragged their territories to the front. The British Empire summoned troops from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa. France did the same with its African and Asian soldiers. Suddenly, men who had never heard of Sarajevo were dying for decisions made by emperors who didn't even know their names. The turning point came in 1917, when the United States, until then neutral, decided to join the war. The trigger was a series of attacks by German submarines on commercial and civilian ships, including American ones. One of the most shocking cases was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, causing hundreds of deaths, including U.S. citizens. In addition, the interception of the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico to invade the U.S., sparked the final alarm. America's entry completely shifted the balance. With fresh resources, modern weapons, and motivated soldiers, the Allies gained strength while the Central Powers began to bleed from within. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany, trying to reclaim lost territories, and Japan took advantage of the chaos to expand its influence in the Pacific. The entire world was involved, even though many nations didn't even know why they were fighting. It was a war that crossed continents, languages, and cultures. A war where soldiers from New Zealand died in fields in France, and African peasants were forced to take up arms in the name of empires that colonized them. World War I was no longer a European dispute. It became the first truly global war in human history, and its cost was still far from being understood. When 1918 arrived, Europe was no longer the same. Streets were empty of men, fields full of crosses, and empires, exhausted, disfigured, on the verge of collapse. Germany, suffocated by economic blockades, military defeats, and internal revolts, finally fell. Its generals knew that continuing to fight was suicide. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice was signed. The silence that followed brought no relief, only the weight of millions of deaths in a world in ruins. But the peace that came next wasn't a balm, it was poison. In 1919, in the luxurious Palace of Versailles, while entire cities were still in ruins, the victorious leaders, mainly France, the United Kingdom, and the U.S., drafted a treaty that felt more like ritual punishment, the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was declared solely responsible for the war. Its colonies were taken, its army reduced to a symbolic minimum, and the country condemned to pay billions in reparations that would plunge it into decades of misery. Europe's map was redrawn like a chessboard, ignoring ethnicities, cultures, and local tensions. Outside, the German people felt humiliated, betrayed, poisoned by a silent desire for revenge. What the leaders didn't realize, or perhaps ignored, was that this peace was actually a seed of hatred planted deep in Germany's heart. A seed that, 2 decades later, would give rise to the darkest regime in modern history. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end World War I, it wrote the prologue to the second. And so, the conflict that was supposed to end all wars only set the stage for something even worse. Now imagine this, an entire generation of young people sent to die for decisions made by leaders who never stepped foot in the mud of the trenches. Millions of mothers buried buried sons, often without even receiving a body. Cities were reduced to rubble, families destroyed, cultures crushed, ancient empires erased from the map like dust swept away by a storm. World War I was not just a sequence of battles, it was the moral bankruptcy of humanity. It was when ideals of honor, glory, and patriotism shattered before piles of corpses, faces burned by gas, and voices that would never speak again. Technology, which should have driven the world toward progress, was used to enhance suffering. Science served destruction. The war showed that in just a few years, humans could turn Earth into an automated cemetery, where killing became statistics and survival chance. But perhaps the scariest part came after the silence. When the cannons stopped and the soldiers returned home, or what was left of them, they didn't find peace. They found unemployment, poverty, political chaos, and a deep emptiness. An emptiness that would gradually be filled by radical ideologies, authoritarian regimes, and voices that promised revenge. That is the true impact of World War I. It didn't end in 1918. It continued in every border drawn in haste, in every unpayable debt, in every traumatized mind. It lived between the lines of the Treaty of Versailles and was reborn in the fiery speeches of the next decade. It was the beginning of the bloodiest century in human history, a century that began with a bullet in Sarajevo and ended with nuclear mushrooms in the sky. World War I was much more than a conflict between nations. It was the beginning of the collapse of a global order, the prelude to an age of shadows that would define the 20th century. Its effects weren't limited to battlefields. They spread through economic systems, redrawn borders, and extremist ideologies that found fertile ground among ruins and rubble. The war destroyed empires, yes, but it also destroyed humanity's trust in itself. It exposed the fragility of civilizations, the selfishness of leadership, and the ruthless price of power. And the most disturbing part of all, it was treated as inevitable, when in truth it was constructed, signed, and executed with calculated coldness. Understanding World War I is understanding why the world still carries open wounds, why so many nations still endure tensions inherited from the last century, why so many wars continue to be waged, disguised as politics, religion, or progress. History is not just a sequence of dates, it is a warning, and this conflict, perhaps more than any other, still screams that warning today. If you've made it this far, it's because you want to see beyond what we were taught. So comment below, what fact shocked you most about World War I? Do you think something like this could happen again? Or is it already happening right before our eyes? Like the video, share it with someone who needs to understand what this war really meant, and subscribe to the channel, because in future episodes we'll continue investigating the secrets, conspiracies, and events that have shaped and still shape the fate of humanity.